Now it's time to jump into the 3D animation software. As we mentioned earlier, we'll use Modo here, but the steps will be essentially the same regardless of the package you're in. The most important thing is to discover how your 3D application handles HDR image-based lighting. We've created a simple cylinder roughly in the shape and position of the rocket as a guide while we set up. In Modo, we'll go to the Layout tab and double-click one of the built-in equirectangular environments to get started. In the Render tab, we can see the resulting landscape rendered out. Stepping to different points on the timeline, we can see that the background changes as the camera moves through the scene. Obviously, we want our background to illuminate the scene and not the current cityscape, so we'll replace the image with the rocket backyard probe we just created. The image looks a little dim, so we'll move over to Settings, and in the Environment tab, increase the environment intensity. Environment is Modo's name for the HDR lighting. Now we can see the image much more clearly. But if we step through the scene, you'll notice that we're seeing the houses on the other side of the street, and not the house that will be behind the rocket in the final shot. We need to rotate our Light Probe HDR image to the correct orientation. We'll select the actual HDR image in Modo's shading tree and then look at its texture settings. Again, you'll need to discover what the corresponding settings are in your 3D application, but the process is the same. We'll start by flipping around the Y-axis, the vertical axis, by 180 degrees, and then slide the rotation some more until the background image lines up with where it should be. Since this is just a round sphere now projecting back on the camera, the features will never perfectly line up, but we can at least rotate to the correct position. If you look carefully, you'll see that the background is mirrored. The wood-paneled wall of the house should be to screen right. To fix this, we can just flip the texture by setting the horizontal wrap to -1 instead of 1. In other applications, you may do the same thing by setting the horizontal texture scale to -100. We can then fine-tune the rotation again. Now we'll play back through the timeline to confirm that the background is aligned relatively close to where it should be. And that's almost it for setup of our lighting source. By the way, you want to make sure you don't have any other light sources in your scene, such as default spotlights or ambient light, since these will affect the balance of the image-based scene lighting we worked so hard to capture on set. The last step is to temporarily substitute our color reference HDR image, the one with the Graytag Macbeth chart. We'll swap the image out, then move to a frame where the chart is visible. Now, if we disable the stand-in geometry, we can render out an image of just the background with the chart. We'll use this later during the composite to remove any color bias that might have occurred in the image probe when compared to our principal photography. Now it's time to work on our model to make it believable. This is potentially the most challenging part of the process. The good news is that most 3D applications come with some great texturing presets that you can simply drag and drop onto your model. Again, it's beyond the scope of this video to show you how to do that for the myriad of different 3D rendering packages out there, but nonetheless, we'll take you through the most important points to create the kind of realism you need to sell the shot. Firstly, models can be unnecessarily big. The more polygons, the more memory they take up, and the harder they are to manipulate in 3D. The model we downloaded for the Saturn rocket weighed in at about 1.3 million polygons, more than we want to necessarily have to manipulate all the time. The solution? Delete parts of the model you don't need. In our shot, we'll never see the top of the model, so we simply lopped off the upper parts of the rocket that never enter the frame. In fact, if you're building your own model from scratch, only build the parts of the model you need. Don't model an entire building if the audience will never see the back of it. Okay, so let's take a look at the default textures that came with the model we downloaded. You can see that while there's quite a bit of detail in the model, the texturing looks pretty flat and uninteresting. More importantly, it looks fake. Why? Partly because it lacks the complexity of real surfaces, and partly because it just looks too darn clean. We'll address the first by adding some more complex preset textures that came with our 3D rendering software, but the second part we'll address by using grunge maps. Grunge maps are simply photographs of real surfaces that have been beaten up by the real universe in which real things live. We've used two main grunge textures on the rocket to add a bit of hard living to the surfaces. While the first rust texture looks a little extreme, it really just adds a variation to how the surface of our rocket catches the light. By applying the images as texture maps to the specular and reflection channels of our rocket surfaces, we break up the way light reflects back from those surfaces. Areas where our grunge map is lighter, the light will reflect better. Areas where the grunge map is darker, the reflection will be dull. Here you can see the result. Our texture looks a lot more complex and a whole lot more beaten up by the elements. Obviously, the more time you have to work on a shot, the more you can dial these details in. It all depends on the budget. If this was a tentpole feature film, we'd only just be getting started. If this is for episodic TV, we may be already over budget. One other thing worth noting is that we added a simple shape for the wall between the rocket and the camera. We won't actually render out this shape, but it provides an extra source of realistic reflection for the rocket's surfacing and shadowing. And that's it. We can now render out our rocket. With our CG rocket rendered, it's time to put it all together. Assuming you rendered your rocket out in 32-bit float space, and if you didn't, revisit the documentation for your 3D software and find out how to, you'll need to set your After Effects working color space to float as well. Choose File, Project Settings, and set the project depth to 32-bit float, and make sure Linearize Working Space is selected. Looking at our project so far, you'll see we have the three solids we set up earlier. We'll use those in a moment, but for now, let's disable them. The rocket doesn't actually appear until frame 192, so that's where we started our 3D renders. We'll add the rocket renders to the timeline starting at frame 192. The immediate issue that arises is that the rocket doesn't appear to be behind the block wall. We went ahead and created some rotor for the wall earlier, which will just drop into the timeline directly above the rocket render. To use it, we first select the rocket clip. We don't want to actually see the rotor, so we'll hide its visibility. Now we choose Layer, Track Matte. Since the rotor is white where we want to cut away the rocket, we'll choose Luma Inverted Matte. Done. Next, it's time to match the color of our CG renders with the color of the background plate. The good news is that we have references for both. We have the reference we just rendered of the background light probe reference image, and we have the reference from the original shoot. We'll begin by adding the CG reference render, then using the rectangular mask tool to crop it to just the chart. We'll then repeat the process for the background plate reference chart. This time, locking the mask after we've created it so that we can move and scale the chart without accidentally selecting or modifying the mask. To help line up the two charts, we'll horizontally reverse the plate reference by setting its horizontal scale to -100, then adjust the rotation a little. And finally, we'll position and scale it to get a nice match with the CG rendered chart. Now we'll select the CG render color reference, since it's the rocket we want to color correct to match the background plate, and choose Effect, Color Correction, Levels. The simplest way to match the color of grayscale squares is to color correct the red, green, and blue channels separately. You can accurately perform this step even if you're colorblind. Set the viewer to display only the red channel. Now do the same for the levels control, revealing only the red channel adjusters. We'll start by adjusting the red-black point. You can open the red input black section for more granular adjustments. What follows is a bit of push and pull as we first adjust the black levels of the CG reference to match, then the white, and then the gamma. When we finally adjust the gamma setting, it'll throw off the black and white points a little, so we'll need to repeat the process. Adjust black, adjust white, adjust gamma, until everything is nicely matched from dark to light along the 6 grayscale swatches. We then repeat the process for the green, and the blue. When you're done, switch back to the full color display and you should find that your grayscale swatches on the 2 reference cards match nicely. Disable and re-enable the levels filter to see the corrections effect. Now we could always dial in the gamma a little more precisely with the luminance level controls, but this should serve our purposes. Now we adjusted the color for the reference chart render, but it's actually the render of the rocket we really want to color correct. No problem, we'll simply copy the levels effect, select the rocket render layer, and paste the effect. And the correction is applied. Now, you'll probably notice that the blacks look too crushed on the rocket. That's because we matched the color cast of the light probe image, not the actual scene illuminated by it. So it's a good start, but we'll want to dial in the general brightness range of the rocket element using the RGB levels adjuster. And that's it. We'll now disable the color swatches since they're no longer needed. Okay, at this point you're still hopefully unimpressed with the realism of the rocket. It doesn't quite seem to belong in the shot. This is where a few good compositing tricks come in. But before we get into those, you may notice some edging issues. These were a result of a little bug in the way the render engine pre-multiplied the image. It's a common problem, so let's look at the fix. With the rocket layer selected, choose Effect, Matte, Simple Choker. We'll set a small value of 0.6, and you'll see that when we press Enter, the problem edge is nicely trimmed away. Now it's time for a coffee break. When you return, we'll take a look at adding diffusion to the CG render to increase realism. Things don't look perfectly crisp in real photographs, and it's not just an issue of focus. Part of the artifact of the photographic process is that light bleeds into neighboring parts of the image, creating an inherent softness called diffusion. Because our render was created by a computer with a perfect visual lens, we don't end up with this diffusion in the render. We won't get into the physics of airy disks here, but just know that this is not the same thing as simply blurring the image, which is a common but horribly wrong way to try to soften the render to make it look more real. Diffusion still has the crisp imagery, but adds a soft layer of blurred image over the top. There are several ways to simulate this. Probably the most accurate is to use what's called convolution. Here in Nuke, we can use a convolve node which applies a filter to each pixel so that it looks more like its neighbors. We supply what's called a convolution kernel to determine how the filter is applied. Using the convolution kernel shown here, most of the pixel's value after the filter is applied will come from the original value of the pixel, as seen by the bright white center, while some of the value of the pixels above, below, left, and right are also averaged in. Diagonal pixels are barely used to calculate the new pixel value. The result is that each pixel looks mostly like itself after it passes through the filter, but a little bit like the pixels above and below, left and right. So the clarity remains, but a slight pollution from neighboring pixels is added, creating the diffusion effect. In After Effects, there's no default convolution filter, but we can create a similar effect with a little work. This is a touch more advanced, so you may want to look to a third-party filter to do the work instead, but the following trick will work in a pinch. We've isolated just the rocket layer to make it easier to follow what's going on here. First, duplicate the CG layer twice to make 3 copies in total. Pre-compose the top 2 copies, moving all attributes into the new comp. Open the newly created pre-comp by double-clicking it, temporarily hide the top layer, and then add a Gaussian blur to the bottom layer. Re-enable the top layer and set its blend mode to Subtract. If you look now at the result, what we have is an image of only the areas where the blur overlaps beyond the original image. That's what's left when we subtract the original away from the blurred version. Back in the original comp, change the blend mode of our pre-comp to Add so that this extra blur gets added over the top of the original render. Now, if we stop here, we've actually made a mistake. What we're in fact seeing is the blurred version of the images again. That's because in 32-bit float space, which is how this project is set up, negative values were created during the subtract blend mode that cancel out with this new add. To fix this, we just need to add a filter that forces the layer out of float to a clipped color space. Any non-float filter will do. Here we've chosen a gamma pedestal gain filter. Because we don't change any of its parameters, it won't actually color correct our shot, but it will clamp the float values indicated by the yellow warning sign. In this case, it's a good thing and produces the effect we're looking for: diffusion. Now, as a final step in the next video, we'll add some atmosphere to the shot in the form of smoke. Now, if we're being honest with ourselves, the shot still looks fake. Why? Well, mainly because we took on one of the most challenging textures possible: reflective surfaces. Reflective surfaces are mirroring all the subtle details of the set. And we shot a light probe on set, but it's a general spherical reflector of the scene. To do reflections well, you need to model all the intricacies, angles, nooks, and crannies of a scene. We may have made a quick copy of the block wall, but more detail is needed to really make reflections look convincing. Which leads us to one of the secret arts of visual effects, variously called camouflage, misdirection, or sleight of hand. The idea is to create something plausible to distract your audience from your fakery. Could be some additional foreground trees, some stylistic shaky motion blurred camera work, or in our case, smoke. It makes sense that the rocket would be smoking in preparation for launch, so we'll go with that. The smoke comes in the form of stock footage shot against black. No need to create sophisticated particle simulations. Just grab a clip from your favorite stock library or go out and shoot some with a DSLR and a permit from your favorite fire marshal. You'll recall that we created solids lined up with the walls behind the rocket. These are almost in the perfect position to act as our smoke. First, we'll duplicate them and move them up above our rocket layer. To keep things neat, we'll rename them to left smoke and front smoke. Now we'll switch to our 3D view and move them forward so that they are positioned in front of the rocket rather than on the walls behind. We won't be needing the original solids right now, so we'll just turn them off. Now to create the smoke, we simply Alt or Option drag the smoke stock footage to replace each of the 2 solid layers. Now, if we leave the layers as is, they'll start to look compressed as the camera circles around the scene. So to keep the illusion of their volume, we have After Effects always orient them toward the camera. Now that our cards are roughed in, we'll rotate them into position and scale them so that they appropriately fit the scene. When adjusting the scale, we'll remove the perspective lock so we can stretch the image horizontally and vertically as we like. Because smoke is so amorphous, you can get away with stretching it a little without losing its credibility with the audience. To help with lineup of our left smoke, we'll temporarily disable the front smoke. Re-enabling the front smoke, you'll see that the two overlap. That's okay, it'll actually help sell the blend. Next, we access the Blend Modes column and set the blend mode for both smoke layers to Add. We can then adjust the opacity down to create the appropriate thickness. To make sure that the smoke lasts to the very end, we'll move to the end of our shot, which is conveniently before the foreground trees would require some tricky roto. And then we'll move the smoke layers so that they end right there. Now, we don't want both the left smoke and the front smoke to be identical. That would look unnatural. So we'll stagger the front smoke to start later, since that's the last smoke to appear on screen and thus has the later start time. To complete the effect, we'll duplicate our wall roto twice and set them up as track mats just as we did for the rocket itself. The smoke now fits neatly behind the block wall. And this concludes our tutorial on adding CG to live action. Of course, you can continue to tweak and add detail from here. One addition would be shadowing to the background wall from the rocket, which you could achieve using the same method as the smoke, but with the other solids created earlier. Alright, let's review. When choosing a 3D animation package, plan ahead to avoid having to learn another application later in your career. When selecting models from stock libraries, look for polygon detail, files created in your application's native format, rounded edges, and nice even UVs without stretching. Shoot a light probe for your scene and gather as much additional measurement and observable shadow detail as possible. Preferably, convert your light probe to equirectangular format for best compatibility with 3D renders. Set up helper geometry to make it easier to align CG objects with real-world scene features. Use reference charts to maintain color match throughout the rendering process. Use grunge maps to add realism to your CG surfaces. Add diffusion to create softness without blurring your CG renders. And finally, add additional elements such as smoke to cover areas of your model that lack photorealism.